All right, so here we are, still talking about stress and health, chapter 15. We're smack dab in the middle of section 2, and that is how we react to stress. So before we get into today's topic and the content, the new content, here's a quick little review of where we are at this point in terms of section 2 and the stress reactions. So we've already talked about fight or flight and the general adaptation syndrome. Quick review of those. Fight or flight is something that you probably are already aware of before you even took this class. You probably learned about it in other classes, or you've seen it in movies or things that you've read, whatever. The fight or flight response is just a common human response to stress. It is something that is millions of years old. It is a physiological reaction that our body has when we immediately encounter a stressful situation. Most of it is predicated on adrenaline being pumped into our body, and then our body having these physical reactions because of the adrenaline pumped into our blood system. The odd thing about the fight or flight situation is that it certainly serves a purpose, and especially served a purpose millions of years ago with earlier humans. It was all about survival. That fight or flight response that our body has enabled humans to assess situations and hopefully keep themselves alive in certain situations. Oddly, there's a lot of discussion about how necessary this response is in the society that humans live in today in 2020. It's not quite as essential a response, just because we aren't living in jungles trying to kill animals to keep our families alive and also to eat. So anyway, there's just an interesting little piece of that fight or flight response. It's still certainly something that we experience. Then we got into the general adaptation syndrome, which kind of builds off the fight or flight, and it's just this methodology that psychologists have recognized humans go through as we react to stress. It's the three parts we learned about with the alarm, the resistance, and the exhaustion phases. Alarm is fight or flight. That's the first part of the general adaptation syndrome. Then we get into the resistance mode. Fight or flight is supposed to be a short-lived reaction, which we'll get to a little bit more later. Then we get into the resistance phase of the syndrome, where we are trying to figure out ways to deal with the stress. We are using information and strategies and skills, and we're trying to deal with the stressor that way. If we do not deal with it in a timely fashion, we may get into the exhaustion phase, which is where this fight or flight reaction gets so heavily taxed because the stressor is so persistent that we start to have detrimental effects to our body. Hopefully the exhaustion phase isn't something that you experience often. Not good for you. So, all right, so wrapped up in all of that, we have it really would come down, I guess, to this resistance part here of the syndrome, but we have all these different ways that we can react, and you guys read about and took some notes on emotional reactions, cognitive reactions, behavioral reactions, and physical reactions. So quick review of those. I always think about the emotional reactions this way. I think of that as reacting to stress with your belly. This is where you have feelings of stress, or the anxiety and the fear and that kind of stuff. That's a belly reaction, would be emotional, which is a little different than the cognitive. If emotional reactions are in your belly, the cognitive reactions we can have are in your mind. This is where your thoughts can become clouded, where your judgment is clouded, where you make bad decisions. You could have recurring thoughts, or you can't think straight, that kind of stuff. That's reacting in your head. Reacting in your belly, emotional; reacting in your head, cognitive. Behavioral is, think of that in terms of something that's much more visible. That is the actions that our body will actually engage in when we're reacting to stress. You can't see an emotional reaction in someone's belly. You can't see someone's thoughts being recurring or clouding, but you can see somebody tapping their pencil on the desk, or tapping their foot on the floor, shaking their leg. Or you can see somebody crying, which just seems like an emotional response, which it could be, but when the tears start coming out, now we're looking at a behavioral, physical action that's taking place. And then finally, you get to physical responses, which seem to maybe overlap, but when we talk about physical reactions to stress, we're specifically talking about illness. This is where your body has physical reactions to, or physical symptoms of illness as a reaction to stress. This is where you get headaches. This is where you get a stomach ache because you're stressed out, and so on and so forth. So those are all the different ways, and within that, there's all kinds of different reactions that we can have. Okay, so why is it that we can have different reactions? Why is it one person reacts one way, another person reacts a different way? Why is it that one stressor can cause us to have physical reactions, but another stressor doesn't? And in fact, we might just have some, mild behavioral reactions. Well, that's what we're going to get into today. I'm going to shift over here, and we're going to look at some of the factors that influence the way we react to stress. All right. So, we're going to number these 1 through, I think it's going to end up being 4. One factor that can affect the way that we react to stress individually is our personality, believe it or not. We spend a lot of time talking about personalities and trying to understand them and what they mean and where they come from. One of the things that we learned is that personality is extremely unique, right? No two people have the same personality. Well, because of that, it can have an effect on how someone will react to stress. So when we start looking at the personality factor, it really comes down to this concept right here, the idea of type A versus type B personality. Have you ever learned about that, or when I say that, does that make sense to you? You know what we mean when we refer to type A and type B? Well, I'm going to read from the book a really good explanation, which hopefully you've already read, but I listed, I'll come back to the little list here, I just sort of compartmentalized it and gave a real succinct list. But the book says this about type A personality versus type B. It says the type A people are always prepared for fight or flight. That's an important part of that personality trait. They have a great deal of free-floating hostility, that is anger that has no real object or focus. They're extremely irritable, and one of the things that irritates type A people the most is delay of any kind. They become impatient waiting in line, tend to move and eat rapidly, often try to do 2 or 3 things at once. They feel guilty when they are not actively doing something. They are also extremely competitive. In short, type A people are always struggling with time and other people, or maybe even both. Note that this describes an extreme version of the type A personality. Most people respond to the world with type A behaviors at times, but they're not in a constant state of stress. It is important to note that psychologists disagree about both the definition of type A personality and its relation to heart disease. They go into some more stuff about how type A personalities are more susceptible to heart disease, and there's evidence that shows that. Ultimately, people that have this type A personality are much more competitive, they're much more concerned about time, urgency, they're much more impatient, they can be very hostile and aggressive, whereas the other side of that spectrum would be the type B personality, where people are more relaxed, more easygoing, they can be patient, they can be calm. Now, there's a whole world of personalities in between those two, and of course, as I just read out of the book, most people can have these type A reactions to stress short-lived immediately. Really, the fight or flight reaction is based on all of this type A stuff. But for most people, that is short-lived, and then immediately after that initial reaction, we can start to come out of that fight or flight response. People that are extreme type A's, their bodies are in a constant state of fight or flight, which, by the way, is really bad physically for your body. When that adrenaline is pumped into your blood system all the time, and it's always there, and people are always like kind of in that mode, it causes all kinds of problems with their arteries, with their heart, and there's a lot of evidence in that, and they talk about that a little bit more in the book. So you're much less vulnerable to stress, much less vulnerable to stress-related illness if you're more on the type B side. Now, I'm not going to spend more time on this, because when we're done with this video and this lecture, the rest of your day will be spent kind of dealing with some of this type A stuff. You're going to take a little test, you're going to watch a little video, so you'll get more on that as we go. All right, that's only one factor that can affect your stress. A second factor that can affect your stress reaction is emotional expressiveness. Quite simply, it says people who are not emotionally expressive are more vulnerable to stress, and research shows have a higher rate of illness. What you should be seeing by now, that high rates of stress correlate directly to higher rates of physical illnesses, and that's one of the themes of the whole chapter, right? So if you are not emotional expressiveness, if you don't have emotional expressiveness, if you are not emotionally expressive, you are going to be less resilient when it comes to dealing with stress. That means if you are a person that holds things in as opposed to letting them out, if you're a person that likes to keep your feelings inside as opposed to expressing them, if you're a person that doesn't like to talk about personal things as opposed to somebody that's really open, you are limiting your ability to deal with stress successfully. So emotional expressiveness, believe it or not, that is something that you can work on. It is something that you can adjust and change. And there's a lot of correlation between that and what the humanistic the psychologists that were pioneering the humanistic model of personality. We go back to like the Maslows and the Rogers. You start looking at that hierarchy of needs, that idea of self-actualization, fully functioning. Emotional expressiveness is a big piece of that for healthy people. So start expressing your emotions, kids. The third factor that can affect your reaction to stress is how much control or lack of control you have over stressors. So the amount of control that we have and whether or not a stressor is predictable can really affect how vulnerable we are to those stressors. And there are some things that are just totally out of our control and out of our power, and those are much more likely to create higher levels of stress than things that we have a little bit of control over. For example, a pop quiz, boom, you don't have any control over that. You show up for class and your teacher just drops it on you. Your reaction to that stressful situation might be a little bit different than, hey, we have a test at the end of the week on Friday, or a quiz on Friday. You've got all these days to plan for it. You can prepare it. It's predictable. You know when it's coming. You can have some control over those days leading up to it and how you prepare for it. So it's a big difference between not having control and not being able to predict it, as compared to having some control over it and it being predictable. Your book, I think, gives examples of this is just something that's real simple, but I think relatable. If you pull up to a railroad crossing and the lights are flashing and the guard's down, you know there's a train coming and you're going to be able to prepare for that loud whistle of the train coming by, right? You're going to be able to deal with that even if it's so loud, it's deafening, and it really bothers your ears. You're prepared for it, you get ready for it. Okay, it's not that stressful, right? As opposed to, you walk into a gymnasium or something like that, and you've all had this happen. You walk into a basketball game in a gymnasium, and it's the end of a timeout, and the scorekeeper on the clock hits that big loud buzzer. You're not prepared for it. Boom, and it hits you like that. Obviously, no one's getting too stressed out, and you're going to get sick and miss school over a train whistle or a buzzer at a basketball game. But you get the idea. When you don't know what's coming and you can't predict it, it is a little bit more jarring and a little bit more stressful. Okay, and finally, the fourth factor that we're going to cover is what we call social support. So there's been a lot of research on this idea of social support and how it affects your reaction to stress. So a couple things about social support. The more social support that we have, the less likely we are to have severe stress-related illnesses, and it's just there's just research that supports it, right? So what are we talking about when we say social support? Well, all human beings on some level have some sort of social supports. Social groups, it's part of being a human, it's part of the experience, offer several different things. And so we're going to look at 4 things that social groups can offer to us that can affect the way we react to stress. So one of those one of those kinds of support that we get is emotional support. This is just simply having other human beings that will listen to us, people that will empathize with us, people that we can, cry on their shoulder, people who we can tell our problems to. That's the first kind of building block of this emotional support. From there, we can experience what's called appraisal. This is where some other person or some group offers feedback to us, offers suggestions, offers opinions. So we're not just being listened to, but somebody's asking us questions, somebody's digging deeper, somebody is giving their thoughts and ideas about the situation. Which leads to informational support. That's ultimately what do I do with this feedback that I've gotten? This is where the person who is stressed out starts to evaluate the discussion, starts to take the thoughts and ideas and opinions and suggestions from the social group. This is where they start to gain insight into what they're dealing with, and they may even get some suggestions on how to cope with it. And then a fourth kind of social support that we can get is what we would call instrumental support. This is a little less touchy-feely, and it's a little bit more just straightforward. This is direct help that we can get from other people. This is where somebody lends us money. This is where somebody allows us to stay at their place whenever we don't have a place to stay. This is where somebody gives us a ride somewhere because we need to be there and our car's broken down. That's what we call instrumental support. So you put all this together. If you have a great deal of this in your daily experience, where you're getting someone that you're getting that idea of a friend that will listen, a friend that will offer ideas and suggestions. If you are then willing to take those ideas and suggestions and that information and you make it useful, and then you may even be able to get that direct instrumental help from somebody. If you have a lot of that going on, it really does increase the likelihood that you're going to be able to deal with stress in a way that's going to be a lot more successful than somebody who is not experiencing all of that social support. All right? And there we have a little bit about the ways that we react to stress. And you're going to spend a little bit more time dealing with the first one we covered, and that is that type A personality stuff. Have fun.